So good morning. Let me begin with the Parsha for the week. This week's Parsha is the second week of the book of Exodus. It's called Va'era, which means I appeared. It begins with Hashem telling Moshe. Moshe had last week gone to Pharaoh and told him to let the people go. Pharaoh not only refused to let the people go, but said he would make it even harder for them. They would have to work even harder. And so Moshe went back to Hashem to complain. And Hashem begins this week's portion by telling Moshe, I appeared to your forefathers and I had promised them that I would give them this land, the promised land, and therefore you don't worry, I will take these people out of Egypt and give them the promised land. Some commentaries read it as Hashem telling Moshe, your forefathers were a lot better. I made promises to them and they had troubles in life and they never complained to me. And you're already complaining. Then the Torah gives a little genealogy for Moshe and Aaron, tells us who their parents were, their grandparents, their sister Miriam. So it gives us a little genealogy. And then the Torah continues to tell us, Hashem tells Moshe to go to Pharaoh. He comes to Pharaoh. Pharaoh says, show me a sign. Moshe throws his stick onto the ground, and it turns into according to Rashi, a snake. Others say a crocodile. And then Pharaoh's magicians are able to do the same thing. They also throw their sticks on the ground. They turn into snakes. But then Moshe's stick goes ahead and swallows up the other ones. It was Aaron's stick. And so then Pharaoh's still not impressed. Hashem tells Moshe to go tell Pharaoh that if he doesn't let the people go, then all the water of the Nile will turn into blood. And indeed it does. All the water turns into blood, the first of the 10 plagues. Then the plagues continue. The second plague is that of frogs. When Egypt is infested with frogs, you're probably familiar with these 10 plagues from the Seder, from our Haggadah Passover story. Then the Egyptians are covered in lice. Then there is a plague of a mixture of wild animals that attack Egypt and destroy things. And then there is pestilence, or a plague, where all the animals die in plague. And then number 6 is boils, where they're covered in blisters and boils. And then number 7 is hail, that hail comes and destroys all the crops. And those 7 are in this week's Parsha. The last 3 are going to be in next week's Parsha. If you're curious about them, you'll have to come next week, or you can read ahead. And then we'll get to the actual Exodus in next week's Parsha. So that's the Parsha in super short, very, very brief. Just one special date coming up this week. This coming Tuesday will be the 24th of the month of Tevet, which is the yahrzeit, the anniversary of the passing of Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Liadi, known as the Alter Rebbe. We did a couple classes about him. We did one class about him in general. We did a class about his arrest and liberation by the Tsars. We did a class about his book, the Tanya. So we've spoken about him before. Very, very important figure in Jewish history. So it's his yahrzeit on Tuesday. That's, I think, covers it. Let me open any quick questions about the Parsha, and then we'll get right into our topic. Yes, Eric?
Why doesn't the Parsha align with the holiday of Pesach?
That is an excellent question. Why are the Parshas not aligned with the holiday of Pesach? The simple answer is that we want to finish the Torah on Simchat Torah, and the story of the Exodus is at the beginning of the book of Exodus, at the beginning of book 2. So it means it's earlier on in the year. Passover is 6 months after Simchat Torah. So it's just in the wrong spot in the Torah. But I did mention last week that the 6 weeks that speak about the story of the Exodus, the first 6 weeks when we read the book of Exodus, are known as Shovavim, and they're always in what we would say the dead of the winter, in the middle of the winter, when it's very, very cold. Days are very, very short, and so according to Kabbalah, these 6 weeks that speak about the Exodus are actually a time that we are able to be freed from any of our own enslavements that we might have, anything that we may be enslaved to, or any challenges that we face that are holding us down. It's a time to be free during these 6 weeks. They're referred to by the acronym Shovavim, which stands for the names of the 6 parshas, Shemot, Va'era, Bo, Bashach, Yitro, Mishpatim. And there was a custom I hope to do a class soon about fasting in Judaism, but when Jews used to fast a lot more than we do today, there was a widespread custom in many Jewish communities to fast twice a week for 6 weeks straight. During these 6 weeks of Shovavim, many communities still have special prayers, special services for the Shovavim. So we do focus on the Exodus during this time because it's a special time of mercy.
Would you like me to write down fasting?
You can write that down. Sure. Any other questions? So let's move. Hopefully, we're all familiar already with much of the Passover story. But I want to move into a different topic for today that we advertised for today. Something that I've been fascinated about for a very, very long time, and I felt it wasn't talked about enough. And somehow today was scheduled to speak about this topic, but it's something that really interests me, fascinates me, and I think really needs to be spoken about and shared. And that is the topic of Philosemitism. So we hear a lot about anti-Semitism in this country, in the world, in history, a lot about anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, as you're probably all very much aware, we've seen a huge growth in anti-Semitism in recent years, both in this country and around the world. Now, I should note, I think it's important to note that the growth is not always linear, and there's actually been a huge drop in anti-Semitism this year in particular in the United States. The ADL last week just came out with their annual report of anti-Semitism, and this year anti-Semitic incidents dropped down to about the same level they were in 2022. After in 2023 and 2024, there was a 200% spike. That means it tripled of the last 2 years, and it has gone down significantly this year in this country. It's still a problem in a lot of other places, and it's still elevated compared to the way it was 5 or 6 years ago, but it's definitely gone down. So it's good to note that, and sometimes people don't hear the good news. They only hear the bad news. But there's still a problem of anti-Semitism in this country, and definitely more prevalent than it was throughout most of our lifetimes. For I think everybody here, this anti-Semitism is more prevalent, it's more common, there's more anti-Semitic incidences, there's more anti-Semitism in the public sphere than we've seen in a long time. And so you hear a lot about it, especially if you read Jewish papers or Jewish go to Jewish websites, you'll see a lot about this. But we often forget that while there's a lot of anti-Semitism, there are a lot more, meaning people that hate Jews, there are a lot more people who love Jews. A 2023 Pew poll showed that Jews were the most liked group in the United States. They looked at various different groups, who dislikes them, who likes them. Jews are the most liked group in the United States. 35% of Americans like the Jews. 6% dislike Jews, and the rest have no opinion. Higher than any other group, higher than Protestants, higher than Catholics, certainly higher than the lowest group is Mormons, of which only 15% of Americans like, and 25% dislike. So Jews are, by that survey, and multiple other surveys have shown very similar things, Jews are the most liked, most popular group in this country. Now, as a Jew who is publicly Jewish, when people look at me, they can see straight away that I am Jewish. I get very regular positive comments on Jews all the time. People randomly walk over to me and say, I love Jews, I love the Jewish people, I love Israel. I get it wherever I go all the time, and many of you have probably experienced the same. In fact, most American Jews have met people who have told them they love Jews. Most American Jews have not met people who have openly told them that they dislike Jews. And I've heard it before, but only a handful of times in my life. I can count it on my hands how many times I've heard anything negative about Jews. I've many, many more times heard positive things. And I think all of you can say the same. I think that's true for all of us in this country. That it depends maybe where you are, that we, especially people know we're Jewish, we tend to hear very positive things about Jews. Yes, there are those that say negative, but there's a lot more positive. which means that overall we live in a society that has a positive view of Jews, of Judaism, of Israel. Majority of Americans support the state of Israel. Yes, there's a lot that strongly dislike Israel, and they're very, very loud. But there's a lot of people that dislike Israel, but the majority of Americans like Israel. You forget that part. And there are people that dislike Israel and dislike Jews and dislike Judaism, and unfortunately, they are often very loud. Sometimes they are impactful in positions of maybe where they have a microphone or a way they're able to get the word out of their hatred. Sometimes they're even able to harm others due to their hatred. But there's definitely a lot more people in this country around us who like Jews than dislike Jews. So most people that we know and that we interact with daily, our neighbors, our coworkers, our friends, even relatives that aren't Jewish, a lot of us have, they are mostly Philosemites. Non-Jews that love Jews or like Jews. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have anti-Semites. We do have anti-Semites. In fact, while in this country there's many times more Philosemites than anti-Semites, that's not true overall. Surveys overall, and ADL does surveys around the world for attitudes towards Jews. Surveys overall show that there's more people in the world that dislike Jews than like Jews. Not in Western countries, less so in most Western countries. There are more people overall in most countries that people that have an opinion about Jews, which a lot do surprisingly, and that a lot more people dislike Jews than like Jews. But there are also a lot of people that like Jews. Thankfully, in most Western countries, particularly in the United States, many, many more people like Jews than dislike Jews. Now, that is not only true today. That has been true, as I'm going to show you, I hope, throughout all of Jewish history. And our history is very, very long. All places that Jews lived and all times that Jews lived in, we have had anti-Semites, people that disliked us, pretty much everywhere and at all times. We've also had Philosemites, people that liked us, people that loved us at all times. We've had both. For some reason, though, we speak a lot about anti-Semitism and we don't hear a lot about Philosemitism. People like to speak about the scary things. People like to speak about the negative things. People don't like to speak about the positive, so you don't hear about it as much. But it is there. Now, the term Philosemitism, where does that come from? So actually, Philosemitism is virtually as old as anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism itself was invented. I think there's various opinions as to who came up with the word, but it began in Germany in the late 19th century. It was invented by anti-Semites because these were people who hated Jews, thinkers, philosophers, pundits, what we'd call today, and public intellectuals, and they wanted something more sophisticated than Jew hater. Jew hater sounds pretty low class. It doesn't sound like a very sophisticated thing. Anti-Semites sounds like Semites is like a sophisticated term, and anti-Semites, it's a lot more sophisticated, so they came up with that term, or in German, antisemit would be the way they said it in German. Well, those same anti-Semites in Germany in the late 19th century, they also, and they were pretty, they wrote a lot and spoke a lot and published a lot. There were anti-Semitic papers in Germany, late 19th century, much of Europe, even in this country. And they also the same people coined the opposite term, Philosemites. They coined that term as a derogatory term for the other Germans that supported Jews. And so in their own anti-Semitic papers, they would refer to people who supported Jews as Philosemites. That's really where the word comes from. But for some reason, anti-Semitism kind of stuck. It's really not a good word, and any expert in anti-Semitism will tell you that we really shouldn't be using the word anti-Semitism because it really should be called as it is, Jew hatred, or maybe to use the 21st century term, Jewphobia, maybe it could be called, but that's essentially what it is: Jew hatred or Jew phobia. That's exactly what it is. Anti-Semitism is just a sophisticated term to make it sound sophisticated and okay or kosher, would say. Um, but for some reason, the term anti-Semitism stuck. Today, it's become the term for. It's no longer a positive thing in a lot of society. A lot of parts of our culture don't look at it positively, and it's somehow stuck as the term. Philosemitism never stuck as much. I don't know why. Probably because people like to focus on the negative rather than on the positive. But what I hope to do today is explain to you philosemitism, the love people have for Jews today, what it is, how it works, the history of it, and most importantly, how it works with anti-Semitism. And I think it's going to give us not only an understanding of all those people that love Jews, millions, tens of millions of Americans that love Jews, and hundreds of billions of people in the world today that love Jews. But it will also, definitely hundreds of millions, but it will also help us understand anti-Semitism better. And how anti-Semitism works as well. Now, a lot of what I'm sharing today is based on Alan Edelstein, who was a professor in Towson University, who did a lot of research on philosemitism. He wrote a book about philosemitism, An Unacknowledged Harmony. Not an easy read, but really he did a lot of work on that, and there's a lot has been written on philosemitism over the years, not as nowhere near as much as anti-Semitism, but there's a lot written mostly in academic circles, and most of it built on Adam Edelstein's original research. Let me open it for questions before we get into the details. Okay. So we're going to look at philosemitism as the counter side, the opposite of anti-Semitism. So now, anti-Semites that dislike Jews not often, virtually always don't say, I just dislike Jews because I was born that way. They always have a reason why they dislike Jews. There's always an excuse. There's always an explanation as to why they dislike Jews. They try to explain that hatred. Sometimes that hatred is religious. Whether Christians who believe that Jews killed their savior, whether Muslims who believe that Jews or Christians believe Jews rejected Christianity, they did, and are upset at them for that. Muslims who believe that Jews rejected Islam or are some sort of threat to Islam. So often it is religious. There's a religious reason to dislike Jews. Often it has to do with economics and power. Jews have too much money or too much power. Or in some places, it was that Jews are too poor and are and often it was the Jews are, taking from society because they're so poor, and they're a drain on society. There sometimes anti-Semites claim that Jews mistreat non-Jews. They take advantage of non-Jews. They cheat them. Or even more sophisticated, that Jews somehow conspire to control non-Jews. And you get into the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, which are still very prevalent, of how there's some sort of Jewish cabal that is trying to control the world, and all the Jews are somehow part of this group that is mysteriously controlling the world. So anyway, but still, if somehow you believe that is true, then that at least gives a valid reason, right, to dislike Jews. Sometimes it's cultural. People dislike Jewish culture. They dislike Jewish personality. It's about the culture, about the personality. They're too pushy. They're too stingy. They're too and all sorts of other descriptions of Jewish personality. If you somehow believe that all Jews have that personality, then because you believe in stereotypes, then that's a good reason to dislike Jews. Sometimes, and for the Nazis especially, it was nationalistic or racial. Jews are foreigners. They're a fifth column. They're not loyal, or they're an inferior race. And the new one that we have since the creation of the State of Israel is that Jews took land from other people, and therefore, of course, all Jews are responsible, and Jews persecute Palestinians or kill Palestinians or whatever else they do to them, and committing genocide. And if you believe that, then that might be, and you believe that all Jews are somehow responsible, then that's a reason to hate Jews. So the anti-Semites always have a reason for it. I'm not getting into justifications. I don't want to get into details of anti-Semitism today. That's not our subject. But there's always a reason for anti-Semitism. What they all have in common is they all express a hatred or dislike for Jews for different reasons. Now, sociologists and philosophers debate, is there really a true underlying cause of anti-Semitism? And these are just excuses? Or is it just that there happen to be a lot of different reasons to dislike Jews, and there's no connection between them? We can discuss that. We can debate that. I don't want to get into that. That's not so relevant for today. What's more relevant is just to note that anti-Semites never hate Jews just because they hate Jews. They hate Jews because they have good reason, at least in their minds, to hate Jews, right? Jews are all these horrible things, and therefore they should hate them, right? They should dislike them. There's what to dislike about them. Well, by extension, if philosemitism is the opposite of anti-Semitism, then philosemites are also usually going to have reasons why they like Jews. Or maybe sociologists will offer reasons as to why philosemites like Jews. Having a reason doesn't make them like Jews any less, nor does it make their like for Jews any less sincere. So often people will say, no, they don't really like Jews. They just feel that, they have religious reasons to like Jews. Well, that means they really like Jews for religious reasons. Just like people hate Jews for religious reasons, people like Jews for religious reasons, but they really like Jews. They're really anti-Semites. It's really sincere. Or they don't like Jews. They are envious of Jewish success and want to copy it. Well, they like Jews then, or at least part of Jewish success, and that leads them to like Jews. So there's many reasons for philosemites, as someone just mentioned. Religion. Some people believe they have a religious obligation to like Jews. That's been true both among Muslims and Christians throughout much of history. Economics. People think Jews are very good for the economy. It's good to have Jews around, good to do business with Jews, good to have Jews in my country, in my neighborhood, in my city, because they're very successful people. They're going to do well. They're going to help my economy. Or good for me to hang around Jews because they're going to make me very successful. Some people admire Jews for their intelligence, for their knowledge, for their culture. Some people admire the Jewish religion. Many non-Jews today admire the Jewish religion. Many even believe in the truth of the Jewish religion. And many non-Jews even go and take steps to join the Jewish religion, either just in practice or to actually convert. Many people, non-Jews, support Israel today. They believe Israel is a miracle, whether a religious miracle or a miracle of hard work or both. Admire its success, believe perhaps it has a religious mission. People love Israel for reasons, but that doesn't make the love any less. Just as someone who dislikes Jews for a reason is still anti-Semitic, and they're not an insincere anti-Semite, they're a sincere anti-Semite, they just have an explanation why they don't like Jews. In the same way, someone who likes Jews for a reason is still a philosemite. It doesn't make their philosemitism any less sincere. Just because they have an explanation as to why they like Jews doesn't make them like Jews any less. You don't need to like Jews for absolutely no reason, just for some sort of natural state of being, in order to be a philosemite. Now, those who believe that there are deeper underlying causes for anti-Semitism beyond the official reasons given, and I personally think there is, would then argue in the same way, would likely argue that there are also deeper underlying causes for philosemitism beyond the official reasons given. It's not just the reasons given, but maybe the reason many people like Jews for so many different reasons, maybe there is an underlying cause for all that like of Jews as well. Let me open to some questions. Yes, Lloyd.
I think there's one other type that, kind of growing up, my friends, we were Democrats, let's say, because our parents, we didn't really know why. and I think there's some people that don't like the Jews. They don't really know why. It's their parents.
There's a lot of anti-Semites that don't like Jews because of their parents or because of their culture. You're absolutely right.
And then the other thing,
Often, though, they have reasons that they got from their parents or their culture as to why. But if they knew more, they would, maybe they would change their minds. We're going to soon talk about changing people's minds. That's one of the key things I want to talk about at some point.
and the other thing is, I knew someone who loved the Jews because they were so humane in the way they slaughtered animals.
Love Jews because of their humane, because their values, because their culture. Yes. Marla?
I think that a lot of times people don't like Jews because they're prejudiced and we try to say Jews. Well, there are people on the other side who like Jews because of their stereotypes. Because you see, like I have met so many people say, I only will go to the Jewish doctor, they're smart.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Sometimes the same prejudice and stereotypes that makes people dislike Jews is the same prejudice and stereotypes that make people like Jews. You're absolutely right. That doesn't make them any less philosemitic. They're still philosemites. They just, maybe it's ill-informed, the reasons for their philosemitism. That's very likely. Yeah, but it doesn't make them any less philosemitic. That's the point I want to bring out here. Yes, Barry.
So I was in Williams, Arizona, and I was sitting outside of a woman's dress store, and Anita was in there. And a couple comes out, two couples come out, and one woman says to the other one, if Sam would have let me stay in there 5 more minutes, I could have Jewed him down. And I never heard that expression.
But people use the term Jewed him down. So there's a lot of, and this is really beyond the subject right now. There's a lot of anti-Semitism that has seeped into the culture, and therefore people say anti-Semitic things, just like racist, right? There's a lot of racism in the culture that is so deeply embedded in the culture that people just say it without realizing until someone points out, that's really not a nice thing to say. So that's common, but that doesn't mean that the person's an anti-Semite. They didn't know there's anything wrong with that often. But so let's get a sense of just how prevalent and pervasive philosemitism is across time and space of history. To do that, let's take a look for a moment at anti-Semitism. Again, and we're going to keep balancing the two. Anti-Semitism has been around for 2,500 years, at least as far as we have recorded, maybe earlier, but at least since before the Classical era. Classical era is kind of the beginning of the Greek empires. Jews have been persecuted throughout this time with anti-Jewish laws, limits on where they could live. They were expelled from places. They had limits on what professions they could do. Many places they were forbidden to own land. There were often degrading rules. There was often general violence, or what became known later in the 19th century as pogroms. But long before the Russians came up with the word, there was anti-Jewish violence was prevalent. Violence was prevalent, going back all the way to Greek times. Going all the way back. These things were very, very popular, very, very common. Much of the anti-Jewish sentiment did not only come from the population, from the general population, often came from the rulers. The rulers are coming from the general population, and often to a large extent, their views and prejudices are representative of the population. So Jews are expelled, they face pogroms, they're forcibly converted, they're put into ghettos, kept from various possessions, heavily taxed, face open murder, and yet somehow though we were a tiny minority, we still survived, and we're still here 2,500 years later. We're the only nation that exists with the same religion, same culture, same people from 2,500 years ago. Even though we weren't even in our own country, we were a minority wherever we were, at least since the destruction of the land of the temple, the second temple. We've been a minority under other people's control, and we've really been under other people's control almost entirely, with a very short exception, for the last 2,500 years. How did we survive? Well, there are many, many reasons given for Jewish survival, and I went to a class on the secrets to Jewish survival. But and the reasons given, of course, are our Jewish loyalty to Judaism. We remained loyal to Judaism throughout. We could have easily assimilated, right? That's what happens to most nations. They don't actually get destroyed, but they assimilate into other groups. We didn't. We stayed true to our culture, true to our faith, true to our religion. We had loyalty to Judaism. We also supported each other a lot, allowing us to help each other. We were also dispersed. We were all over the place. Even if we were murdered in one place and annihilated in one country, there were other Jews in another place, and we were able to show up somewhere else. So we dispersed a lot. So that certainly helped. And of course, the most important reason, I believe, is that we had Hashem's hand. Without the hand of Hashem, we would have never survived. The Talmud compares Israel to a sheep among 70 wolves, and without a very, very strong shepherd that can fend off the 70 wolves, the sheep will never survive. But we survive because Hashem protects us. So all those reasons are good reasons why Jews is a tiny minority. Tiny minority meaning in virtually every place that we lived in history, we were never really more than 5% of the population. And in many places, we were a fraction of a percent of the population. We were a very, very small minority in every single place. Even places that had very, very large Jewish communities, compared to the overall population, we were very, very, very small. There were cities that had Jewish majorities, but in regions, in countries or states, we were always a tiny minority, always controlled by much, much larger groups. So all those reasons are true. But there's another crucial factor that people don't mention. We survived because the non-Jewish majority neighbors and hosts of the places that we lived let us survive. We were powerless for most of our history. In many places, Jews were not even allowed to hold arms. Even if we were allowed to hold weapons, we were outnumbered. We were a minority, a tiny minority. Again, less than 5% in virtually every place that we were. And most places even much, much less than that. We were a tiny minority. Which means that if they wanted to get rid of us, they probably could have. But they chose not to. All those who wanted to kill us and all those who wanted to destroy us, and throughout in every generation there were plenty of those who wanted to kill us and who wanted to destroy us. Antisemitism has been pervasive and continuous throughout history. And yet we survived because in every time, every place, there were other non-Jews who had the power and stopped the anti-Semites from destroying us. So yes, there were people who tried to destroy us. There were other people who stopped them from destroying us. We forget about those other people. In World War II, but I'm going to go way before World War II. There were World War II, they destroyed a lot more of us than they did any other time. And there were some of us survived. But long before World War II, there were people that helped us survive. Now, there's no way we could have survived in each and every place as we did without other non-Jews deciding that we should be allowed to live. Not just survive, but thrive and grow and be able to support ourselves. All that was, and be able to observe our religion freely. That was thanks to, most of the time, there were non-Jews that wanted that to happen. Now, we often had Jews in high places. Jews with connections, who had influence. And I once did a class on the Stadlan, on Jewish lobbying. It's on the podcast, where Jews always had what was called the court Jew, or Jews that were connected to the powers that be, virtually in every place and time that we lived, that had a lot of influence, and was a big part of how we survived. They were able to influence those in power to allow us to survive. But even with all the firstly, how did the Jew get into a high place without a non-Jew who's the ruler? Jews were never the rulers, right? The non-Jewish rulers are allowing Jews to be their doctors, to be their financiers, to be their advisors, to be their court managers, or whatever role these court Jews had, right? Non-Jews are allowing Jews to hold these roles and hold these positions. Maybe because the Jew was the only skilled person? Possibly. Maybe they trusted Jews more than their own compatriots, also possibly. But they did choose to allow Jews, despite their anti-Semitism, to be in these positions. But most importantly, with all the connections, This is really important in general about when we talk about lobbying. You can lobby from today to tomorrow, but you need to actually convince someone. With all the connections you have and all your power of persuasion, you need to actually convince them to listen to you. The fact is that these court Jews were successful time and again in convincing rulers to protect their local Jews, to not expel them, to allow them to worship freely, to allow them to engage in commerce and support themselves. They persuaded these rulers to do so. Now, yeah, the lobbyists helped convince them, but they were convinced. Now they're supporting the Jews and allowing the Jews to survive. So, yes, and every time there were Jews in powerful places, but you have to give credit ultimately to the decision maker, not to the lobbyist. The lobbyist doesn't make decisions. It's the decision maker that's ultimately the one who's responsible for the decisions they make, right? We often forget that, right? We say someone has a good lobby, so therefore everyone listens to them. No, that clearly people made that decision. You got to go to the decision makers that made the decision, right? So here you had non-Jews who in power who made decisions to allow Jews to survive throughout all of history. That's how we're still here. Now, and often they did, by the way, they paid them off as well. They often gave them a lot of money too. But still, even so, they could choose to refuse that money. Often it was argued Jews were good for the economy. That's why we need Jews. Jews have unique skills that only Jews can do. And that's why we need Jews in the country and we need to protect them. Sometimes it was even argued that we need Jews in our country because Jews are going to help the Christians read the Bible. They won't know how to interpret it properly without the Jews. That was one of the explanations, one of the arguments given, and that worked many times. All very good, but ultimately they decided to leave the Jews alone and allow them to survive and allow them to thrive. For all these reasons, again, philosemitism could be for a reason. But they liked the Jews, despite many anti-Semites who wanted to destroy them. Remember, if nobody disliked them, it wouldn't be a big deal that we survived. The thing is that there were in every time and place people who wanted to kill us and wanted to get rid of us and wanted to expel us and wanted to forcibly convert us, and they were unsuccessful. They were successful sometimes, but by and large, over the big picture, they were unsuccessful. We're still here because there were other people who pushed back and said, no, we don't want to expel them. We don't want to kill them. We don't want to forcibly convert them. We don't want to destroy their livelihoods. We want them to continue. We don't want them to stop them from worshiping Judaism. We want them to continue. So there were people, yes, there were always people standing up to harm Jews. There were always people standing up for Jews. Now, when we compare that to other cultures, in both Muslim and Christian lands, Jews were essentially the only minority. In Muslim lands, there were Jews and Christians. In Christian lands, there were only Jews. Now, when Rome adopted Christianity in the early 4th century, most of Europe was pagan. What happened to them all? They were all killed or forcibly converted. There were many Muslims living in lands that later became Christian, like Spain. What happened to them all? Or Sicily? What happened? They were all exiled or forcibly converted. There were no Muslims in Europe till the late 19th century. And yet there were lots of Jews. Jews were allowed to live, intentionally allowed to live in Europe. The Muslims allowed both Jews and Christians to live, but that was it. Before Islam came to much of the Middle East, it was mostly pagan. Where are all those pagans? They're gone. They were forcibly converted or killed or exiled. Only Jews and Christians were allowed to live in the Muslim world. So both Christians and Muslims intentionally decided to let Jews live and survive in their society, even though there were agitators and individuals and people in power who wanted to get rid of the Jews and wanted to stop them and wanted to make life difficult for them and wanted to harm them. There were people who defended them. That's non-Jews who defended them. Jews were a tiny minority and practically had very little power ever. It was non-Jews in each time who defended them. So what kind of people are these Philosemites? So Philosemites, like anti-Semitism, is across the spectrum of society. Sometimes they're leaders, sometimes they're kings, sometimes they're princes, sometimes they're bishops, sometimes they're local mayors or local business leaders, sometimes imams. Sometimes it is the church itself or the mosque itself where their official policy is tolerance towards the Jews. Sometimes they're just regular tradesmen, craftsmen, people of other professions who support Jewish neighbors, Jewish friends, Jews they know. Sometimes it's random people from the population who help Jews facing a challenge. And it's these various people over history, not the ones who didn't care one way or another. Because the ones who didn't care for Jews one way, they didn't love Jews, right? There were plenty of those too. But those people didn't protect the Jews, they didn't harm them. But they wouldn't have stopped those that hated us from harming us. They wouldn't have stopped the people who hated Jews from harming Jews. But there were Philosemites, people who actively stopped haters, anti-Semites, from harming the Jews. That's why we're here today. Let's take a quick dive into history just to get a sense of how prevalent Philosemitism was throughout our long history. It already starts right at the beginning of our exile, going back 2,500 years. Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian emperor who destroys the temple, exiles the Jews to Babylon, essentially begins our very, very, very long exile. He took a liking to a young Jew by the name of Daniel, who he makes as his survivor. And his advisor. And on Daniel's suggestion, he begins to even financially support poor Jews, as described in the book of Daniel. But it goes even further. His son, Avil-Merodach, who goes even further, and he frees the only surviving king of Israel, of Judea, Jechaniah, and he appoints him as prince of the Jews of Babylon. Now you got to like Jews to free the last surviving king, let him out, and make him prince of the Jews, and make him the official leader of the Jews. And we're told at the end of the book of Kings that he invited him to dine with him regularly at his table. So he's his good friend with the leader of the Jews. It continues on in the Persian Empire. Cyrus the Great of Persia, he is convinced that he has been anointed by God to rebuild the temple and get Israel and restore the Jews back to Israel. He is more supportive of Jews than perhaps even than the Jews themselves, because the Jews don't want to go back. And he pushes them to go back, and even donates from his treasuries to build the temple. And this policy goes through various shifts through later Persian emperors, some supporting Jews, some supporting the temple building, some hampering it. But throughout the Persian Empire, and the Persian Empire lasts in various iterations for a very, very long time, for probably close to 1,000 years. Many emperors are supportive of Jews. Many appoint Jews to high positions. They give Jews have a lot of freedoms, are very successful within the Persian Empire. There are times that Jews are persecuted, times that Jews are arrested, times that there's violence against Jews. But they're also, their period in Persia is pretty tolerant, mostly thanks to leadership and commoners, regular Persians, who liked Jews. When the Greeks swept the ancient world, originally they were very positively disposed towards Jews. We're told Alexander himself was positively disposed towards Jews. Then later Israel fell under the Ptolemaic kingdoms based in Egypt, controlled Israel. They also were positively disposed towards Jews, to the point that Alexandria soon had the largest Jewish community outside of Israel, with a massive Jewish community that was very, very well integrated into Greek life in Egypt. It was only later, when Israel falls under Syrian Greek rule, that they attempt to forcibly Hellenize Jews. That's where the story of Hanukkah comes in, and this persecution as well. When the Romans come to the Eastern Mediterranean, they are originally positively disposed towards Jews. In fact, Jews moved to Rome and many other Roman cities. And many Jews become citizens, and Jews are allowed to freely worship in Rome. And notably, Jews are the only religious group in the Roman Empire that are not forced to worship the emperor. Worship of the emperor was part of Roman requirement. Every religion in Rome had to work in the Roman Empire had to worship the Roman emperor and include Roman gods, except for the Jews. The Jews are the only ones who are able to get away from it with it, out of respect for Jewish monotheism, and that continued the entire period of the pagan Roman Empire. Now, Romans also were extremely anti-Semitic. And there were many Romans that hated Jews. And we have records of Romans that write horrible things about Jews. And we know that there were regularly Romans attacked Jews in different places. There were regular, what we'd call today, pogroms against Jews, violence against Jews. Particularly in the land of Israel, the Roman rulers were despotic against Jews, had a particular hatred towards Jews. And there were some Roman emperors that were very anti-Semitic. After the destruction of the temple, a Jewish tax was started, that all Jews had to pay a tax that continued for hundreds of years, that was only for Jews. All Jews had to pay a head tax. But there were plenty of leaders that were positively disposed towards Jews. Julius Caesar issued a charter granting Jews religious freedoms and the rights of Roman citizens. Even Jews that were not citizens, they were Jews in the Roman Empire, had rights, unique rights that weren't given to really any other non-citizens within the Roman Empire. Now, the Jews would largely retain those rights of freedom, not to be forcibly enslaved, of freedom of worship, of freedom of being able to live where they want. They would largely retain those rights throughout the Roman Empire, and later to a large extent in Christian Europe as well. Those same rights that Julius Caesar issued in his charter. By the way, that charter was later would become a very, very common thing in virtually every place that Jews lived. There was a charter that kind of stated Jews' rights, sometimes rules against Jews, depending on where it was, right? Some places were more positively disposed towards Jews, some less. Those charters were often changed, but virtually every state and city-state and kingdom in Europe over the years wrote charters with the rules of the Jews. There were Roman emperors who were extremely positively disposed towards Jews. The Talmud tells us about the Emperor Antoninus, who the Talmud says even secretly converted to Judaism. We know that there was a period in the Roman Empire after the destruction of the temple that countless Romans became Jewish, converted to Judaism, or countless Romans at least believed in monotheism, even if they didn't go through the actual conversion, believed in Judaism. And Jews were then very popular. They were also very hated at the same time. We had both. There were a lot of Romans that disliked Jews, even more Greeks. There were a lot of Romans that liked Jews and wrote positively about Jews. It went both ways. And this phenomena continues throughout history. After Rome adopted Christianity, there were countless anti-Jewish edicts because, after all, Jews had rejected Christianity. Jews were accused of deicide, of killing God. Somehow that is possible. And yet, Jews were allowed to remain in the Roman Empire. And they were largely free within the empire, maybe limited. They weren't allowed to go to Jerusalem or even parts of the land of Israel. And there was violence against Jews, but they were overall allowed to be free. That was very different from the way the Romans treated pagans. The pagans, in everyone who was pagan in the Roman Empire, was forcibly converted. By the end of the 4th century, you could not be pagan in the Roman Empire anymore, even though their grandparents were all pagan. But there were no pagans left. They were all forcibly converted or killed or forced to leave. But the Jews were left, not forcibly converted. In 598, Pope Gregory issued a decree that essentially called for a status quo. Don't increase the Jews' rights and don't decrease them. Whatever rights they have, continue giving them. Whatever rights they don't have, don't give them. Limiting them, somewhat anti-Semitic, not giving us freedom, but Also, but allowing them to live, and allowing them to live with some level of freedom. And that back and forth is going to continue throughout Christian Europe. People that want to increase Jewish rights, people that want to decrease Jewish rights. It keeps going up and down. There's a lot of rules against Jews, but there's also a lot of rules for Jews. It goes both ways. It's like a pendulum that keeps swinging back and forth. Jews during this period have very good times, very bad times. There's kings and bishops that favor them. There's those that hate them, even those that massacre and expel them. We know at least one example in the what we'd call the Dark Ages. The Visigoths in Spain in the 6th century expel or forcibly convert all the Jews living in Spain. They're Christian at the time. But the important thing is that throughout much of the former Roman Empire or the Eastern Roman Empire, in what had been in Christian Europe, Jews were allowed to live and allowed to freely worship, thanks to protectors in power and support among the general population. And there were, again, in all these times, there's people who dislike them, people that want to get rid of them, people that want to forcibly convert them, people that want to kill them. Sometimes they're successful, more often they're not, because there's other people that don't want to kill them and don't want to get rid of them and want to protect them and want them to survive. And this story really continues. During the Middle Ages, Jews in Europe begin experiencing mass murder and what we later started calling pogroms. Now, during this time, during the Middle Ages, the Jews were largely welcomed in the Islamic world. They weren't given full rights, but they became pretty prominent in the Islamic world. They were able to, they had a lot of rights. They were able to do a lot of things. They were free. They were able to worship freely. The only really exception in the Middle Ages is the Almohads, who take Morocco and Spain in the 12th century, where they murder and forcibly convert all Jews to Islam. And many Jews flee. Maimonides famously fled then. But throughout much of the Middle Ages, the Islamic world was more pro-Jews than anti-Jews. Now, that doesn't mean there were no anti-Semites in the Islamic world. There were many anti-Semites in the Islamic world at the time. But the people in power, the powers that be, and most people were pro-Jewish. In Christian Europe, not so much. Life was a lot more difficult. Historians generally consider the First Crusade in 1096 to be the beginning of pogroms or violence against Jews in Europe. Before that, there were anti-Jewish edicts. There were some times of expulsion and forced conversion, but there weren't really these mass murder events that we know of in Europe. But it really starts 1096 with the First Crusade, where the First Crusade marches down the Rhine Valley in Germany and essentially destroys and murders, pillages every Jewish community they can find. And yet, the Pope, Clement, I think it was, Pope Urban, explicitly forbade the murder of Jews and issued edicts that the Crusaders should not harm Jews. They didn't pay attention. But in almost every town that the Crusaders came to, the local bishop and princes made efforts to protect the Jews and parts of the local populace. The Bishop of Speyer which was at the time was one of the major Jewish communities in Germany, managed to protect the Jews by hiding them in his castle. The Jews in Worms and Mainz were not so lucky. Not because the bishops didn't try. The bishops of Worms and Mainz also, these were all church cities that belonged to the church. So the bishop was essentially the leader, the prince of the city. So the Jews in Worms and Mainz, the bishops did try to protect them and hide the Jews in their castle. Unfortunately, the Crusaders managed to get into the castles and murder all the Jews inside. In Cologne, the Jews escaped murder by hiding among Christian peasants in the countryside. That's Christians and Christian peasants, farmers, that were serfs that were happy to hide Jews and protect them. So although thousands, probably tens of thousands, were killed in the Crusades, there were clear attempts by leaders and commoners to protect the Jews. And that's why they weren't all killed. And that's why many did survive. Over the Middle Ages, in addition to countless massacres, sometimes where non-Jews make efforts to protect Jews, many attempted massacres where whether the leaders or other commoners protect the Jews. Jews are also expelled from many places, especially in the late Middle Ages, in the 14th, 15th centuries. They're expelled from England, from Spain, from Portugal, from Sicily, from Lithuania, from countless German states. Jews are expelled from many places. But remember, for every place that expels them, they go somewhere else. There are other places that welcome them in. Amazingly, although in the 15th century Jews were expelled from much of Western Europe, they were expelled from France, I mentioned, they're expelled from much of Western Europe in the 15th century. And although they were Catholic monarchs that were expelling them in the name of the church, the papal states, ruled by the Pope in Italy, let them in, welcomed Jews in. And so did countless other places, such as Morocco and the Ottoman Empire and Poland and other places that did allow Jews in. And of course, we could go through history. We spend a long time going through step by step, country by country, century by century, event by event, and show that, yes, there were countless attacks by Jews, and we go through all the Jewish history like this, but for every attack by Jews, there are people protecting them. For every attack against Jews, I misspoke. For every attack against Jews, there are people protecting Jews. Sometimes the attacks succeed, sometimes they fail. They're always being attacked. There's always anti-Jewish rules being made, people who hate Jews and trying to harm them in one way or another, and there's always people protecting them, people looking out for them, people trying to help them. In the 17th century in Europe, Jews are granted increasing rights by non-Jews. Notably, probably the first place that Jews get close, not full emancipation, but pretty close to it, where they have almost total freedom, is in Holland. They're given unparalleled freedom, and that leads Amsterdam in particular to become in the 17th century the leading Jewish city in Europe, because Jews can thrive over there and build businesses and build colonies in the Dutch West Indies and the Dutch East Indies, all running out of Amsterdam. Now, good economic reasons to let Jews in. They had good reason to do so, the Dutch. They also were Protestant, and they let Jews in and they had defeated their Spanish rulers, who were Catholic, and they let Jews in as a response to the Catholics who had thrown Jews out. So they had religious reason to let Jews in, and they had economic reasons to give Jews freedoms. But there were plenty of other places that didn't see the same, that didn't do the same. And there were plenty of people within Holland that were anti-Semitic. By and large, they gave Jews freedoms. These were Christians who chose to give Jews freedoms. And as a result, leading Dutch thinkers, artists, admire Jews, build close relationships with Jews in Holland during that time. In England, Jews had been banished from England in the 13th century. And that yet in the 17th century, Oliver Cromwell let the Jews back in. Now, certainly there was an economic incentive to do so, but it was not just economics. It was also very much thanks to a renewed religious support of Jews by Puritans, who Oliver Cromwell was part of. And they believed in a religious need to let Jews in, to be tolerant of Jews, and to have Jews living among them successfully and peacefully. In most of the Americas, which also was, at least in the parts that weren't controlled by the Spanish and Portuguese, but the Americas controlled by the British and the Dutch, American Jews were welcome. They had their problems, they had their troubles, there were anti-Semites everywhere. There were people who did not want to let Jews in, but ultimately Jews survived and thrived. As we move into the 18th and 19th century, there's a strong movement to emancipate Jews in Central and Western Europe. And eventually, by the late 19th century, Most of Europe, with the real exception of the Russian Empire, most of Europe emancipates Jews, meaning gives Jews full freedom, full citizenship, like the same as Christians. And they're fully free, regular citizens. Who are carrying out these emancipation drives? Who's debating emancipation? Christians among themselves. Those that are for emancipation and those that are against emancipation. Christians who are anti-Semites and Christians who are philosemites. Even after emancipation, there are plenty of anti-Semites. And yet they're debating anti-Semites versus philosemites. And this continues. Now, even in the Russian Empire, where Jews don't get emancipation until after World War I, and after the fall of the Russian Empire, Jews don't get emancipated. Even over there is a debate over emancipation. It's not just Jews begging to be emancipated, it is Christians arguing that we should emancipate the Jews. Of course, the Tsars were paranoid, anti-Semitic, and those arguments didn't get very far, unfortunately. In modern times, there are many anti-Semites as well, especially in the third world, especially in Muslim countries, where the vast majority of surveys show the vast majority of Muslims today are anti-Semitic. And yet, in Western countries, in the United States especially, most people are positively disposed towards Jews. That's what surveys show. In Europe, it's a little bit lower than here, but it's still, there are more people that like Jews in Europe than dislike Jews. Jews here have equal rights, they're respected. As we said before, in the United States, you're much more likely to hear a positive comment about Jews than you are to hear a negative one. That doesn't mean there's no anti-Semites. There's a lot of anti-Semites here. There are millions of them. If there's 6% of the population, right, if there's 6% of the population, then that's at least 18 million anti-Semites, right? There are millions of them in this country. But there are more people that like Jews. Even in third world countries, where there are a lot of people that dislike Jews, there are plenty of people that support Jews and the Jewish state. Even in Muslim countries, where anti-Semitism is extremely strong, there are many Jewish supporters. They might be a minority, but there are plenty of people that support Jews. In fact, just a few weeks ago, it was a Muslim, Ahmed al-Ahmed, who stopped the terrorists in Sydney, putting his life on the line to do so. And he's been clear in interviews that he's done since that he believes in protecting Jews and he believes in living peacefully with Jews. He could have done nothing. He could have ignored it. And he's one of millions, right? There are millions and millions of Muslims and Arabs that support Jews. They're a minority, unfortunately, but there are philosemites. Throughout history, yes, we've had lots of anti-Semites, but there's also been lots of philosemites. And that's how we survive. That's why we're here today. A lot of other reasons, but a big part of it is non-Jews who supported us and still do today. I apologize for going overtime, but a little bit more. So how does this dichotomy of philosemitism and anti-Semitism work? So I think we really need to look at it at a very different perspective from how we normally think of anti-Semitism. And I think we can see this if we look at the first recorded major anti-Semitic incident, which is the Purim story. Many of you may be familiar with this story. Jews are living in the tolerant Persian Empire, where Jews are citizens, and they have rights like any other minority. Thanks to Cyrus, who liked Jews, right? And believed that he was the savior of Jews. He's the anointed one, the Messiah of Jews. And they have leaders who rise to power in the government. There's Daniel, there's Mordechai, even the queen, Esther, is a Jew. And yet there is one man, Haman, who hates Jews and is determined to destroy the Jewish people. He rises to power and he convinces the emperor Ahasuerus to allow him to carry out his plan to kill all the Jews. And he chooses one day, the 13th of Adar, when the anti-Semites across the empire, knowing that there are anti-Semites across the empire in every place that Jews live, can rise up freely and kill Jews hoping that it will lead to all Jews being killed. But Queen Esther, after discovering the plot, convinces the king, Ahasuerus, to change his mind. And as a result, Ahasuerus does change his mind and kills Haman, puts Mordechai in his place, gives him the same job, he's a Jew, and he allows the Jews to kill anti-Semites who attack them on that day of the 13th of Adar. So this story, without going into the details, is a story of an anti-Semite in power, Haman, who convinces the king to issue an anti-Semitic decree allowing anti-Semites throughout the kingdom to kill Jews. Then the queen, a Jew, changes the emperor's mind, convinces him to spare the Jews and kill the anti-Semites. The Persian Empire then, within it, has both anti-Semites and philosemites. The anti-Semites dominate, they use their power to go after the Jews. When the philosemites take over, they use their power to protect the Jews. This gives us a whole new look of anti-Semitism. It's not they always hated us, they always tried to kill us, but we survived. Rather, there are always anti-Semites, there are always philosemites. There are always people that like us, always people that hate us. Sometimes the haters dominate, and we're in a lot of trouble. Sometimes the people who like us dominate, and then we're okay. Then we're saved. So Jewish history then is not a story of Jewish suffering and survival the way it's usually told, but it's a story of how people like the Jews while others dislike Jews, a small minority, a small powerless minority, always powerless, a small powerless minority with very little ability to really dictate their own future because they didn't have any real power. But they had friends and enemies virtually in every place and time they were. Sometimes their friends dominated, sometimes their enemies dominated. It went both ways. And perhaps the best example of this is the Dreyfus affair, which had took place in the last decade of the 19th, towards the very end of the 19th and very beginning of the 20th century. Alfred Dreyfus was a Jewish military officer. I think that's a good subject we should do, a Dreyfus affair. But it's a story of its own. But just very briefly, Alfred Dreyfus was a Jewish French military officer, assimilated Jew, who was very, very highly decorated and respected officer, who was convicted of treason for passing secrets to the British. There was strong evidence showing that it wasn't him, it was another officer. And French society split, with many French advocating against Dreyfus, and against Jews in general. Those that advocate against Dreyfus included Jews cannot be trusted, get the Jews out of France, Jews are a fifth column, while many others advocated for Dreyfus and against anti-Semitism. Why should we hate the Jews? They're good people. They're loyal. They're good. Dreyfus was framed falsely. And this battle played out in the newspapers then in France, back and forth. It split French society in two over the anti-Semites and philosemites. In the end, in that story, the philosemites won. Dreyfus was reinstated and acquitted and reinstated took about 10 years or so till for the trial to make its way through. But Jews had many supporters and many detractors, many lovers and many haters within French society. That battle that played out in France over Dreyfus has been publicly playing out not just in France, but in most of Europe. In fact, as long as we have newspapers, which goes back to the early 19th century, there have been pundits, writers, opinion writers who write things for the Jews and against the Jews. It's still true today. Newspapers that are pro-Jewish, newspapers that are anti-Jewish. It's been continuous throughout as long as we've had papers, but it goes long before that. It's a debate that's been playing out in Europe and the Middle East, where Jews have lived for thousands of years. People supporting Jews, people dislike them. And that battle continues to play out today. Jews have supporters in the general population and detractors, philosemites and anti-Semites. What both sides, though, seem to have in common is the irrational focus on Jews. Why? Well, that's for the sociologists to explain why we irrationally focus on Jews. We've done other classes, we spoke about anti-Semitism, but there is, not everyone, certainly not everyone, perhaps not even a majority of the population, but there's a very significant minority of the population in virtually every place that Jews have lived, and even in places that Jews have not lived, that are irrationally focused on Jews. And that's even though Jews are tiny. Jews in 1900, when governments fell over the Dreyfus affair in France, and when the newspapers were daily having articles back and forth, pro and against, Jews were less than 1% of the French population. Jews have never been a high number in any country that we've lived. And yet, for whatever reason, Jews are more visible. People have taken interest in Jews. People have this irrational obsession with Jews on both sides. People that like Jews, people that dislike Jews. And really, our history has been a battle between the Philosemites and the antisemites. Now, it's important to point out that people and societies are not anti-Semitic or philosemitic. People themselves are often contradictory. Often the same person can argue strongly for Jews and against Jews. Look at the story of Purim. The king, Ahasuerus, was first anti-Jewish and encouraged Haman to destroy the Jews, rejecting the huge financial incentive that Haman offered. And then he turns around and he's supportive of the Jews and kills Haman for even daring to think of killing the Jews. So people change their mind about philosemitism and anti-Semitism. Countries that were once strongly anti-Semitic turn philosemitic and back. And there's always people on both sides, but sometimes one side dominates, sometimes the other. Germany was anti-Semitic for a long time. Then they became very pro-Jewish. Then they became, with the Nazis, very anti-Semitic. And now Germany's a fairly pro-Jewish place, but with its share of anti-Semites. Or look at Spain. Spain for a long time was pro-Jewish. Then it became anti-Semitic. Then they expelled the Jews. Then they invited them back in. And now once again, Spain's turning on its Jews the last few years. Or look at Iran. Iran has been a place where Jews were welcomed and loved, and then they were rejected. And it goes back, and there's countless. Every place moves back and forth. Individuals also do. Societies change. People change. Ideas gain popularity. People with different ideas gain control. So the view of the movement between philosemitism and anti-Semitism doesn't really stay constant. People change, societies change, but what is constant is a constant obsession with Jews. It's amazing how many people and rulers and people who you'd never think of were obsessed with Jews. Napoleon, who is Emperor of France, ruler of Europe, busy conquering Europe, waging wars, has countless letters about the status of the Jews and how to treat the Jews and what the Jews should be. He keeps writing about Jews. He had the time in all of his wars and between all of his, running France and controlling all of Europe, he had the time somehow to worry about what to do with the Jews. And it wasn't just Napoleon. It's countless leaders and thinkers. And it's amazing how many people for whom Jews should have been only a footnote are so focused on Jews. But it's been true throughout history. Both those that are, Napoleon also went both ways. One could argue whether he's philosemitic or anti-Semitic, maybe a bit of both. But a lot of that goes both ways. But what's amazing is how much people focus on Jews. And how much, although Jews are so tiny and so insignificant, how much people spend time thinking about, talking about, debating about what to do with Jews and how to treat Jews. Where does that leave us today? So today, as I covered before, most of the Western world is largely philosemitic, although there's a significant and unfortunately growing pockets of anti-Semitism in this country and throughout the rest of the world. Much of the third world, meaning the undeveloped world, is anti-Semitic, particularly the Islamic society. Why the third world is anti-Semitic is a subject of its own. I know Alex is into that. A lot of it might have to do this. One can offer different theories, but a lot of it might have to do with Soviet campaigns decades ago, but much of the world, this third world today, is anti-Semitic, and yet wherever you go, there are going to be philosemites. Now, if anti-Semitism is the irrational, obsessive hatred of Jews, then what can we do to change it? So once we know and understand that the irrational obsession with Jews, whatever causes it, whatever leads to it, has been around forever among us, at least a significant segment of society, where Jews have lived and even where they haven't lived, it's been around for a very long time. That's probably not going to go away. There's probably nothing we could do about that. We don't really know the reasons for it, even though we have lots of different theories as to what causes it. But that's been around for a long time. And the reasons for it are really beyond our discussion today. But more than trying to undo the irrational obsession with Jews, in other words, tell people, stop thinking about Jews. Go on all those campuses where people are marching against Israel and say, just don't worry about Israel. There's a lot of other things to worry about in life, right? A lot of other countries to worry about, right? You don't have to march just about Israel, right? And you have the school boards and city councils that have packed these city councils with the most attended and debated items on the agenda are whether the city council should support Israel or condemn Israel, right? And clearly people on both sides are obsessed with Jews, right? So rather than trying to get them to stop obsessing with Jews, what we can change is the way they view Jews. Get them to view Jews in a more positive light. And this can be done, firstly, recognizing that there are philosemites by giving voice to those philosemites, as well as condemning and drowning out anti-Semitism. The way it's not done is by ostracizing people with anti-Semitic views. And when we've done classes on how to deal with anti-Semitism, we spoke about this more in detail. Because anti-Semitism